before you're closed in CAMHS, there should be some discharge planning, and that would be done with your either lead practitioner or with your doctor or with someone else from your team who you know well, and there should be a care plan constructed so that it's clear if things don't go well once you're discharged, you know how to get help and you know how to get help quickly if needed. So once you're discharged, technically you're back to your GP. You may have supports from a voluntary sector organisation or from one of the other organisations that support people with mental health difficulties, including Health in Mind or IAPT, and also drug and alcohol services. So there may be other services involved, but that should be clear in your care plan. And you've got that bit of paper or letter or an email, and you can refer to that so that if things don't go as agreed and as planned, there's a really clear way to access support and help so that you're not left with no idea of what's happening. When you are discharged, there is a letter that is written to your GP and to the young person letting them know that the discharge has happened, and then that goes on your record, and that serves to close the episode of care with CAMHS and hand your care back to the GP. There's increasing amount of information available for young people to prepare for transition. So there's the new transition module, which I'd encourage people to use and to watch. There's also the transition protocol and transition policy that we've got within our organisation. And what that does is it encourages that everyone who is transitioning from CAMHS to adults has a 6-month transition CPA to start the process of thinking ahead, to start working out, is this going to be the right thing for this young person? If so, how do we make sure that they're prepared for it? How do we make sure we manage the expectations realistically? Because there are differences between CAMHS and adult services, and it's really important that we're open and honest about those differences, what's available, what isn't, the kinds of approaches that can be different, and also the expectation that when someone moves from CAMHS to adult services, that the degree of responsibility and autonomy will change because they become legally an 18-year-old, a young adult, responsible for their own care. But we all know that that doesn't happen developmentally overnight. So the more we can try and blur that date, the better in my view. So that's why we prepare beforehand, use as much information as possible to prepare, make sure that as many people who are involved in the care are aware of what's happening, make sure that there's a clear care plan, and ideally make sure that there's a person identified in the adult services who you'll be transitioning over to. And if possible, I would think it would be a good idea to go and visit the adult service before you transition, so you know where it is, you know what it looks like, and you start to familiarise yourself with it so that it's not such a shock when you're asked to go into clinic on the first day and you see this whole new place, you're meeting new people, a new team. So the more you can do to prepare beforehand, the better in my view. So transition can be a really difficult process potentially. There's a lot of change, there's change in faces, change in relationships, change in where you might be seen. Transition as well, it's important to note that it's not just transition from CAMHS to adult service, but it's transition out of CAMHS to another service or potentially back to the GP. The more you can do in preparation for this with your CAMHS clinician, the better in my view. So the protocol that we have says that this should be done 6 months before you're discharged. So if you're being discharged at 18 to the adult service, it should happen age 17 and a half. For other young people who might be discharged out of CAMHS, it would be, I think, much better if this was a process that was managed proactively. So work with your clinician, work with your other supports, your carers, your teachers, or other important people in your world to prepare for this, because what we don't want to happen is that there's a cliff edge where suddenly everything changes, and that can be hugely difficult for a young person, and sometimes it can be quite distressing. And sometimes at that cliff edge people fall between services and fall between the gaps, and that's not what we want. So we do have the package for transition, which is a package put together by experts by experience, by young people who use services, by clinicians, by families, to make sure that we give the right information at the right level for young people preparing for their transition. And the module also includes various parts to support young people with self-care, with harming potentially, with well-being, day-to-day well-being as well, looking after themselves, looking after their mood, making sure that they're eating healthily, making sure that they're not inadvertently engaging in some what we call maladaptive coping strategies that might work in the short term but in the longer term won't be helpful. And there's some work to be done on that in advance of a transition if needed, to make sure that there are strategies in place and supports in place for young people if they are leaving a specialist service like CAMHS. If a young person has been discharged from CAMHS and they need to access the adult mental health service, this is best done via the GP, but it can be also, they can be accessed via the accident and emergency department if things are really, really critical and they need support immediately. But the majority of people who are re-referred into services would go via the GP. And for anyone who's been discharged from CAMHS, the GP will have a letter that will have a discharge care plan included in that, and that care plan should have been co-constructed with the young person, and the young person should have a copy of that, and that should then say, if you're running into this problem or that problem, here's how you can get support with it. And if it's not working, go back to your GP and they can review whether you need to be re-referred to the adult service. If you find yourself in the position, as all young people will, of eventually leaving CAMHS, there will be changes, and one of the big changes, and perhaps the most difficult for some young people, will be the loss of a relationship with a significant person in CAMHS, their clinician. And that probably shouldn't be underplayed, and the more preparation that you can do with your clinician around what you're going to be doing next, how to achieve a good ending and a safe ending, that would be discussing what options are available in the community for you, and your CAMHS clinician should be able to help you identify those and also help you to be referred to those. The GP can do this as well, and of course you can self-refer to many services. So I encourage people, if they haven't got a next steps and they're approaching discharge from CAMHS, then speak to your clinician, speak to your team, and ask them how they can help you to identify what's going to be happening next, who will you be going to, and if necessary, make that referral to the next service. We recognise that transition can be a really difficult time and that there's a lot of change going on, and sometimes when you're in the middle of all that, it can seem as though just when you need more support, the support's being lost to you. Think about what else is out there, what other supports are there. Work in advance of your transition with your clinicians, with your family. Involve other people in making sure that the transition is as safe and also is right for you. And if things aren't right and you feel things are missing, then flag that in advance and make sure that that is built into your transition plan. The work that we're doing at the moment with the transition protocol, with the 16 to 25 pathway, with the development of IROC and other youth services, these are all innovative approaches to make sure that the transition process is made more easy to navigate, is more person-centred, and is also ultimately a better experience for young people. I encourage people to maintain their hope that things change. They do change, and I know that from my clinical work that I see every day working with young people in the outreach team. But if you are experiencing a particularly difficult time, then make sure that you flag that, because there will be support for you, and that is something that we are working towards making much clearer and much more easy to access.